Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Another big, busy day in Westminster, and in exactly an hour's time, MPs will begin voting on a series of amendments that have been debated all afternoon, and the big circus is there in Westminster today. Pro-Brexiteers, anti-Brexiteers are out there, flags flying everywhere, and all sorts of intrigue in Westminster. There are two amendments, I think, that really matter. One has been put down by Yvette Cooper, and it basically says, look, if by the end of February a deal hasn't been agreed, then Article 50 should be extended, probably until the end of the year. And that, of course, would mean us actually not leaving on the date that we were promised, and would probably mean the UK's participation in European elections. But perhaps there's more interest on the Conservative side of this today. You remember last night that there was this amendment that had been put down by Graham Brady that the ERG group, led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, said they would not support. And the Brady Amendment says, look, we want to get rid of the backstop and find alternative arrangements. But what the ERG was saying is, oh, no, that doesn't go far enough. We need the whole withdrawal agreement to be opened up and debated. And interestingly, once again, we got something from the Prime Minister that we've seen many, many times before. It's when she says something clearly and definitively and then tends to change her mind. I mean, here she was back at the end of November after her withdrawal agreement, her 585 pages, had been brought back from Brussels.
If people think somehow there's another negotiation to be done, that's not the case. This is the deal. It's the result of what has been tough and difficult negotiations over a significant period of time. And as has been said, this is the deal that is on the table. This is the best possible deal. It's the only possible deal.
The only possible deal. This is the only possible deal. There are no renegotiations to be had. You're going to have to like it or lump it. And yet, here she was in the House of Commons this afternoon.
What matters today is that Parliament makes it clear to the European Union that this issue of the backstop is the one that needs to be dealt with. This is Parliament's opportunity to respond to the European Union, who have said that they want us to tell us what we want, and this is our opportunity to tell them.
So she wants to reopen the backstop and reopen the withdrawal agreement. She wants legal changes. She doesn't make it clear whether that's just on the backstop, but the withdrawal agreement is to be reopened. So I'm guessing that as a result of her saying this, it is now much more likely that Graham Brady's amendment gets passed tonight. And in conjunction with that, something broke very late last night, and it's not easy to put in simple terms, but it's known as Plan C, or the Malthouse Compromise. And maybe you're all getting pretty sick to death of all these shenanigans, but hey, here it is. And it was brokered by Tory MP Kit Malthouse. And it would see, with Brexit, the UK honouring its £39 billion divorce payment in return for an extended Brexit transition lasting till the end of 2021 to give us time to work out a new trade deal, get acceptable solutions to the Irish border and avoid hard border checks. All this really does, it's an attempt to bring together the Conservative Party, to kick possibly the can down the road where the big decision gets made, not now, but in 3 years' time. I think it's a horrible party compromise that actually puts the interests of the unity of the Conservative Party above the interests of getting the right Brexit deal. And what it would do, of course, is in fact really to push the final Brexit settlement up to the next general election. But there is some unity. So I tell you what, folks, and this is a mug's game in a way, you could say it's like trying to pick the winner of the Grand National. But assuming the Brady Amendment gets passed, and I can't see that it won't, she'll be looking for alternatives to the backstop. She'll be looking to reopen the withdrawal agreement. Can we expect concessions from Mr Juncker tomorrow? And he'll be speaking at 2:30 our time in the European Parliament. And don't worry, folks, I will be there to greet him. If you think that maybe that change of language we've heard from Barnier and others over the course of the last few weeks means that actually they are going to give us something, call 0345 6060 973, or maybe you think Juncker will be as arrogant, as out of touch, and as classically post-lunch as he normally is at 2:30 tomorrow, then text to 84850. Or maybe you think actually nothing in the end is going to undo this Brexit deadlock, and perhaps the extension of Article 50 becomes ever more likely, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course Facebookers, you can comment there too. Norma on Facebook already has. She says they've had nearly 3 years. How much longer do they want? Well, the answer to that, Norma, is, according to the Malthouse Compromise, another 3 years. It really isn't good enough. John is a first-time caller from Edinburgh. John, do you think tomorrow Mr Juncker is going to be the nice guy?
He never has been up until... So I don't see why he should change now.
Yeah, I get the point you're making. So what happens then? What happens then? She goes back and says, I've been mandated tonight by the Parliament to get a different withdrawal agreement. If it's literally just a point-blank refusal, what then?
Well, here's what I've got to say. And I would like for her to take this suggestion that I've got, and really everything really, the success of this withdrawal stands in the back of the backstop. There's a whole lot of fear and distrust that there might be a permanent lock-in.
Yes.
So, in order to ameliorate, what people fear is that the UK will be held to ransom over things like fishing rights by France and Gibraltar by Spain, etc.
John, we fear that under this backstop we'll be at their mercy. Absolutely.
Exactly. Now, what I'm thinking along the following lines is that to remove or ameliorate these potential threats or risks, we should update the withdrawal agreement to include a legally binding statement that UK sovereign and territorial assets cannot be used as bargaining chips in future trade negotiations. Now, if the EU go along with that, then that would bump up their integrity, credibility, because when you get to the negotiations, if any member state tries to bring in these particular issues, that then they wouldn't be permitted during trade negotiations.
Well, John, I don't think Theresa May's language tomorrow will go quite as far as that, but I get your point. We need protections. We need concessions that mean we will not be stuck inside the backstop and at their mercy. John, it's a fair point. I tell you what, if Theresa May came back in 2 days' time with that, this withdrawal agreement, as amended, would go through the House of Commons with a pretty healthy majority. James is a first-time caller from Carlisle. Good evening, James.
Good evening, Nigel. Huge fan. I love listening to the show.
Well, thank you very much. So what concessions are we going to get from Juncker tomorrow?
I don't. I think they've made their position absolutely clear with the EU. And I'll tell you something, Nigel, I think it's all just smoke and mirrors from here on out. I genuinely think that they've come to call me a conspiracy theorist. I know you're not a big fan, but I think that they've come together behind the scenes to just... May's obviously thrown out this ludicrous deal to begin with, so the public just go, no, that's disgusting. And so whatever they follow up with is more likely to get passed through, if that makes sense. So I think
offer people something that is truly dire, then make it just plain bad, and they'll say, you know what, we surrender. We've had enough of all this Brexit. Now, I do get what you're saying.
They're trying to break us down, essentially, so we just agree to anything in the end, and we just stay in the EU.
Yeah. Well, I have had some callers who were Leave voters over the last few months who have said they are beginning to feel beaten down by it. I have to say, though, James, the majority of Leave voters that ring are actually blooming furious that Parliament's not doing what they were told to do.
Exactly, Nigel. I think it's having... Well, they've misjudged the terrain at every point, and I think they misjudged it with the initial Brexit vote. Thank you for that, Nigel. I know that was purely you. And then, after that, they just keep misjudging the terrain, and they think we're stupid, and so it actually makes you speak...
James, I tell you what, James, Mr. Blair thinks you're really stupid.
Oh, no.
And at 6:30, I'm going to play you some footage of Blair talking about ordinary voters, so please stay on the line and wait for that. James, I get the point. They're trying to beat us down to accept something that really isn't very good. Nigel, are these amendments advisory or are they binding? The reason I ask is if the Cooper Amendment gets passed, can Theresa May just ignore it? The absolute legal truth on this is that we have a piece of legislation that David Davis piloted through Parliament. It is the Withdrawal Act, and the only way that statute can be reopened, that law can be reopened, is by government. Now, whether there is some devilish device, devious device that Mr Burko, the Speaker, can come up with to throw out of the window everything that's been in the UK parliamentary settlement since 1688, I don't know. But I think it would be advisory, but the government would not go against the settled will of the House. I think that's so legally it wouldn't be binding, but in effect, I think the truth of it is that it would be. Nathaniel is calling from Dover. Good evening, Nathaniel.
Good evening, Nigel. So, I don't think Parliament, I realise how weak we look at the moment. To suggest that we may even go back and remotely negotiate is either them being disingenuous or ridiculously stupid and naive. And there's something I want to raise about this Yvette Cooper's amendment.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that it's impossible to extend past July because of the European elections? How would that work?
Well, yeah, OK. So the argument is we could extend it just for 3 months until July. And that would mean, because the new European Parliament take their seats on July the 2nd. So the argument is, if you extend just up until July the 2nd, you don't need to contest the European elections. But the point is, Nathaniel, that over that whole period, from the end of March, the whole of Europe will be fighting European elections. The entire European Commission will be reappointed by November. The next few months, there'll be no time in Brussels to negotiate with anybody. They are taking on, the European Commission as they see it, the biggest Eurosceptic populist threat in their lifetimes. It's coming in Italy, it's coming in France, it's coming in Germany, it's coming everywhere. So, Nathaniel, extending it until July would frankly be pointless.
And also, personally, I think this is tactics at play. They're pretending like they've got a hand to go and negotiate. But quite frankly, I voted Remain, by the way, bear in mind. Quite frankly, with how Italy's looking at the moment, I think the sooner we leave, the better. Because, look, we saw it happen with Spain, Greece and Italy before. And apparently Italy's looking even worse than before. Yeah. So I think this is tactics at play. They're pretending to go and negotiate. They'll come back without something. So they go, oh, well, looks like we've got to withdraw Article 50.
Well, if they do that, they'll be in real trouble. Nathaniel, all I can tell you is if Mr Juncker tonight genuinely believed that this government would leave on WTO terms, then I think she could go to Brussels with a strong hand. The trouble is, even when she says it, nobody, including me, ever believes her. Thank you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:15, and time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz. What does Mr Juncker do tomorrow when Mrs May says she's going back to Brussels to reopen the withdrawal agreement, to try and change some of it, and in particular to get a massive change to the Irish backstop? What does he do? Well, we did hear him on this back on the 11th of December after she'd first pulled the vote on the deal knowing she'd lose it. He said this in the European Parliament.
I will see Mrs May this evening, and I have to say here in the Parliament, as I did say before in this Parliament, the deal we have achieved is the best deal possible. It's the only deal possible. And so we cannot...
Oh, they like that, didn't they? They like that.
There is no room whatsoever for renegotiation. But, of course, there is room, if used intelligently, is room enough to give further clarification and further interpretations without opening the withdrawal agreement. This will not happen. Everyone has to know that the withdrawal agreement will not be reopened.
Well, there we are. That was Juncker back in December saying it will not be reopened. We can add a little something and explain it all a little bit. And interesting tweet came out today from Tony Connolly from RTE, the Irish news service, and it said, a senior EU source has told us that during a phone call today at 12 p.m. Brussels time, Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker told Theresa May there would be no reopening of the Irish backstop or the withdrawal agreement. The source said Mr Juncker conveyed to Mrs May it would be fruitless for her to come to Brussels on the basis of an attempt to reopen the agreement. So that's what was said on the phone. Nonetheless, she's gone ahead and said what she said in Parliament. She had to do that. She's trying to unify both wings of her party. There are peace brokers out there trying to bring her party together. The question is whether what they come around is actually acceptable or not. I expect tomorrow Mr Juncker will grandstand in the European Parliament, more or less repeat the same kind of speech. But that does not mean that there's no room for change. And I repeat the point, and Mick in Dagenham gets this completely. He said, if tonight we remove no deal through the amendments, then the EU won't reopen negotiations. And Mick, this is the point. They are actually beginning to come under some pressure over there. You know, the voice of French and German industry is beginning to be felt in Brussels. And if they thought we were going to leave with no deal, well, you know what that means. They wouldn't get their 39 billion. So where's that going to come from? So there is, I still think, despite what Juncker says tomorrow, if the government holds firm and says it is not going to reopen, it's not going to reopen the question that we could leave on no deal, even though we don't really believe it, she might just get something. But I suspect she'll get rebuffed tomorrow. That is my view. Andy is a first-time caller from Manchester. Good evening, Andy.
Morning, evening, Nigel.
So, what do you think Brussels do?
Well, to set my stall out, I was an avid Remainer when the referendum happened. But having watched how these buffoons have behaved towards the British, I'm unfortunately now I'm an avid Leaver.
Really? That's a hell of a conversion, Andy.
Well, it gets even better than that, Nigel, because I've got a Polish wife.
Yeah.
You can imagine the rift in our house sometimes with this, but the way that I look at it is that the most powerful tool in negotiation is the ability to walk away.
Absolutely.
And if you take that away, then you're taking scraps off the table, whatever they give you. And I look at this and the way that Juncker has behaved with this, and I think that, well, let's see how he behaves when there's radio silence and no deals on the horizon, and see if he wants to come back to the table then and do an 11th-hour deal.
Andy, absolutely. You know, if they really thought that was a serious prospect, if the government said, actually, do you know what, the hell with it, we're not changing the legislation, we will leave on the basis of no deal, we've got the law in place, only we can change it, then I think, as you say, a deal would happen. Unfortunately, Andy, what this all says to me is, and I've been predicting this for some time, that I think, ultimately, an extension of Article 50 becomes the most likely outcome.
But again, you extend it this time, and then they think, oh, well, we can push them to the precipice again, and they'll extend it again. And they've already said, to be fair, that they're not prepared to extend it unless there's going to be another referendum or a general election. Well, we had our vote, we lost on the Remain side, but if people actually open their eyes and look at this now, do we really want to be a part of something where we seem to put everything in and have put everything in for decades, and what have we really received out of it?
Well,
that's the way that I've started to look at it.
Andy, who wants to be run by a bunch of arrogant, unelected old men based in Brussels?
Absolutely. Couldn't have put it better myself.
Better to have a Europe, and I do believe in a Europe that cooperates together, are friends together, trade together, have a European Council that meets regularly, agree how we deal with issues like pollution, cross-border crime, reciprocity for students, all of those things we can do, like next-door neighbours living in a street, wanting to. But this structure, Andy, where it's run by the European Commission, is rotten to the core.
Well, with no constituents to answer to. Unelected members sat there dictating how we will run our country. I'm sorry, but not anymore. And,
you are the classic Damascene convert, I have to say. Andy, thank you very much indeed. Great call. Bernie is a first-time caller from Hartlepool. Hi, Bernie.
Good evening.
So, is there going to be some budge from Brussels in the next few weeks?
I just don't know how much longer we're going to continue showing our backsides to these people in Europe. We're becoming a disgrace. May's manifest of malfeasance needs putting in the outhouse where it belongs. The EU were very clever, you see. They saw how much diarrhea there was in Parliament and realised 585 pages was not sufficient, so they give us another 30. Now, if we're not out by the end of March, we need a general election or the Pied Piper of Hamelin to get rid of all the vermin in the building.
Well,
I mean, you look at the front benches, Nigel. You've got Thornberry on one side. She doesn't know whether it's Shrove Tuesday or Ash Wednesday. She probably puts her knickers on inside out and backside first.
Well, who knows about it? It's a bit personal, Bern. It's a bit personal, you know.
Maybe we should check her. We've got Hammond on the other bench. He might have more success reading tea leaves than prophesying the economic future of this country. And the problem we have is that we haven't got a party to vote for. We had when you were with UKIP. We need a new People's Party or a vote for the independent at the next elections. And the promises really has to be not just getting out of Europe, but abolishing the House of Lords.
Yep, I'm with you on that.
Stopping all funding to the BBC. Abolish the licence fee unless NBC becomes a national broadcaster.
Right.
Abolish hospital parking charges.
I couldn't agree. Well, Bernie, I'm with you, but hey, we're not discussing a general election, but I do get your total disenchantment with career politics on both sides of the House. Rajiv is calling from Richmond upon Thames. Good evening.
Mr. Farage, good evening. So good to speak to you.
Welcome.
Mr. Farage, you know, throughout this Brexit fiasco, if there is any one person the people of United Kingdom listen to, must be you. Because you are the one who has actually made it very, very clear to them, crystal clear, like the ice on a Swiss mountain. And, you have just stuck to your guns and you have made it clear all the disadvantages of being in Europe. And you know what? People voted to be out of it, and people have been dragged. They are dragged, chains around their necks. They are dragged to be into Europe. This is awful. British have never ever acted in their past. You look at the Britain's history. When British said to India, "We will give you independence," they did. Wherever they have gone, they have stuck to their promise.
But
this is what Britain is famous for.
But Rajiv, at the moment, we appear to be led by very weak people. We have a parliament that doesn't seem to respect the will of the people. Where do you think this all ends, Rajiv? I mean, do you think that miraculously, as the date approaches, a deal of some kind does get done or not?
I really truly believe that Mrs. May, with due respect to her, sir, she's just dragging her heels into oblivion. And on the March 29th, Britain will go without a deal, and this is exactly what Britain actually wanted, and this is exactly what will happen, because British people never voted for any concessions. They never went. They don't want to go to Europe and beg them for concessions.
No.
They don't want that. They want to take their destiny in their own hands.
I have to say, Rajiv, the sight of a British Prime Minister going to Brussels begging Barnier and Juncker for concessions is in itself completely and wholly humiliating. I thank you for your call, your thought on Britain's place in the world, and your passion. Barry on Facebook says the EU are just showing us how desperate they are to keep the UK in. They'll do anything to try and stop it. Well, Barry, what they'd really like is us to have a second referendum and change our minds. It worked in Ireland twice. It worked in Denmark once. But you've noticed the People's Vote campaign, so-called, have gone very quiet because they know a second referendum is not commanding much response out there in this country. Sky-breaking news, French President Emmanuel Macron says the current Brexit deal is the best possible and is not renegotiable. Aren't we lucky to have such lovely friends across the whole of Europe? You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:30 and time for the news with Lisa Aziz. Well, while we contemplate the votes that will be starting in about 25 minutes' time, and it looks like Mrs May is going to get some sort of mandate to go back to Brussels to renegotiate, and so far, Mr Juncker is saying, no, we're not going to renegotiate, and Emmanuel Macron's backed that up, but, as the next few weeks go by, they might begin to change their minds, particularly if they think we're going to leave on WTO terms. But a little treat for you. Tony Blair today was speaking in Mayfair in London and was basically explaining to all of us why ordinary people really aren't capable of making decisions about their own future.
It's one of the curious things about politics. I mean, I had a conversation with a member of public a few months back who was basically saying to me, why are you arguing for all this? We just got to get onto it. And I started to explain the difference between being in the single market and customs union and not. And he said, well, you're just trying to say to me that you know far more about this than I do. And I said to him, I was Prime Minister for 10 years. If I don't know more about this than you do, I mean, it's ridiculous. But he obviously regarded this as a typical elitist comment. Yeah. And this is the absurdity of it. Look, I always say to people, I've followed Newcastle United. I'm a supporter of Newcastle United. If the game's on the television, I'm going to watch it. But I know that Rafa Benitez, has forgotten more about football in one day than I'll ever know. Okay, now It's not because he's smarter than me. He might be smart. He probably is smarter than me, actually, but in his case. But it's because that's what he spends his life doing.
Oh, dear, oh, dear, oh, dear. What utter total condescension. You know, when Mr. Blair said he met a member of the public, why not just say a peasant? An ignorant peasant, because that's what it really sounded like to me. It shows the absolute contempt they have for ordinary people. And do you know what? For all their Oxford degrees, the one thing I have learnt about our political class is they are guilty of groupthink, because they spend so much of their time and their lives together when they're growing up, at school, at university, in Parliament, how they spend their weekends. They generally have the same conclusions on virtually everything, whereas the general public tend to be more instinctive about things. And that is what our democratic process is all about. When you listen to Blair, you almost think the logical conclusion of what he had to say today is why, I tell you what, Tony, why not cancel democracy? Why not get rid of the nation state? I've got an idea. Let's have a European Union and put an unelected commission in charge, because clearly that's what you want to keep us in. Right, that's enough of Blair for one day. Nigel, let's be realists. They are not going to renegotiate the deal. We are the ones in the precarious situation, says Robert in Glasgow. Well, I don't see our position, Robert, as precarious if we negotiate correctly. Nigel, we need to stand firm for a no-deal Brexit. The Cooper Amendment must be defeated. Well, that's out of our hands sitting here right now, but we'll find out in about an hour's time. The MPs need to listen to the people. I'm so angry with the behaviour of those MPs. Well, Neil in Liverpool, let's hope we do leave on March the 29th, and we may well leave on March the 29th, but if we do, strikes me the deal could be absolutely awful, and that the real decision on our future relationship will not, according to this Malthouse compromise, be decided for a further 3 years. It just isn't good enough. Duncan is a first-time caller from Grange over Sands up in Cumbria. Good evening to you.
Hello, Nigel. Very nice to speak to you.
Welcome.
A simple peasant from the north.
Oh, yes. Oh, I bet you'd love to meet Mr. Blair, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah, actually I would, yeah. What an obnoxious man. Yeah. No, the point I'd like to make, Nigel, which is a general point, if I may, I listened to the live parliamentary debate this afternoon.
Yep.
And I listened to Ken Clarke saying quite clearly that the vote was advisory. Yeah. Therefore, it was for Parliament to make the decision. Now, Yvette Cooper's amendment tonight would, in effect, if that is the case, make it pointless almost in having another vote, in carrying on, in doing anything. And I speak as a person who voted and would still vote to leave. Why on earth do you have a referendum if it's only advisory?
Yeah, we ought to really, I think, Duncan, maybe we should award a sort of Tony Blair Cup for the person who can be the most arront every day of these parliamentary debates.
Without a doubt.
But it sounds like Ken Clarke, who, by the way, on a personal level, I find very charming and great fun to be with. A very affable character. A very rounded character, too, which in politics is unusual. He's got hobbies and interests outside of politics, which I rather like, because most political figures these days, I promise you, Duncan, are dull as ditch water. But for Ken to say that's outrageous, constitutionally, a referendum is advisory, but we were told by everybody, including the official government leaflet that came through our doors, we will implement the result of your decision. So I think, Duncan, it's outrageous for Clarke to have said that, isn't it?
Well, I think it is outrageous for him to say it was advisory because it just makes you feel as though, as a Leave voter, I almost feel as though I've wasted my time, and indeed wasted 3 years high blood pressure or whatever it is, in the hope that this would go through. The day after, when the vote came through, I was over the moon that we were going to leave the EU. Now I just feel utterly disillusioned.
Duncan,
but I still would vote to leave again.
Duncan, it doesn't in the end. They can frustrate us, they can delay us, they can behave appallingly, but the genie is out of the bottle. We will leave the European Union, I just can't tell you when. Keep the faith, Duncan, thank you. Peter says to me on Twitter, hang on a second, I thought the unelected twerps in Brussels got all the say. Since when does Macron get the final word? He needs to get his own house in order rather than slating us here in the UK. Well, you're right, of course. The negotiation is done. by the European Commission, but all their decisions ultimately have to be agreed at a big get-together of the European Council. And you've got certain EU leaders who are pro-EU fanatics. Macron's one of them. Varadkar from the Irish Republic is another. So they love to be seen to be supportive. But, Peter, given that his own popularity rating is now down to 18%, lower even than Hollande's was at this period of his presidency, I would have thought he should be worrying more about the Yellow Jackets, as you say, than what happens in Brussels this week in terms of negotiations. Nigel, could a union walk into talks and say they were not going to call a strike? Well, absolutely. These people calling to scrap the no deal are complete and utter lunatics, says Irene in Scotland. No, they're not lunatics, Irene. They're absolutely rational. They're totally rational. They're members of Parliament who do not respect the Brexit vote, and in many cases are actually going against their own vote for Article 50. And I'd remind you, 498 of them voted for it. Fred is calling from Islington. Hi, Fred.
Hello, Nigel. Thanks for having me on. We've spoken before.
I know we have, and welcome back.
Oh, great. Thank you. I won't take up too much time. What I would like to say is that anybody voting for this Yvette Cooper amendment is actually sabotaging the Brady Amendment, and I really don't see any point to the Brady Amendment if Cooper's goes through.
Well, no, that's not quite true. I mean, look...
Why not?
Well, OK, hang on. I do agree with you that anyone that votes for the Cooper Amendment is, in fact, effectively trying to take away from the Prime Minister her most powerful negotiating tool. All right, we'll agree on that. But don't forget, the Cooper Amendment only kicks in, namely the push for an extension of Article 50, if no deal is agreed. What the Brady Amendment sets out to do is to get a change in the withdrawal agreement so that it can go through Parliament. So one doesn't actually directly contradict the other, but it weakens the opportunity of the Brady Amendment getting anywhere through Theresa May in Brussels.
The EU will just stall. They'll stall and stall and stall until the Cooper Amendment becomes effective, and then they push us towards a second referendum.
Yes, Fred, that's exactly what they've wanted right from the very start. I get that. Doesn't mean it has to happen, though. Fred, I thank you for your point, and I'm crossing everything that the Cooper Amendment doesn't go through. And I did think, well, maybe those Labour MPs from Leave constituencies who come back after the weekend have seen how their constituents are feeling, and maybe they won't support the Cooper Amendment. But behind all of this, of course, is Momentum, who are campaigning and lobbying hard within the Labour Party and threatening Labour MPs with deselection. We'll see how the numbers play. Simon is a first-time caller from Coventry. Good evening, Simon.
Hi, Nigel.
Welcome.
Yeah.
So, what do you think's going to happen? Are the EU and Mrs May going to find a great deal that passes?
No, I don't really know. I mean, my view is that, well, I want to say that obviously I'm like yourself. I'm totally fed up with the whole thing. But since day one, we knew that they would be trying to get a second referendum. This issue for me is the best thing that's happened to British politics since in my lifetime. I'm 52. The reason is because everyone in the country now, or anyone who's half awake, can see that there's a cabal in this country who are controlling the society and not listening to the will of the people. And that's become more apparent for everyone. And they really are out of touch with how people feel in this country. You can't put a leaflet through the door and say they're going to do one thing, which is effectively the no deal or getting a trade deal, and then come up with all this stuff obfuscating the process. I mean, British governments of the British government do not make mistakes. Everything has been done intentionally to thwart this process. Governments with this type of resources do not make mistakes. And this is just all playing out now, but people can really see this.
So if the light, Simon, has been shone on this, is it time we don't just deliver Brexit, but perhaps change our entire political system?
Absolutely, and I honestly believe that's going to happen.
Well, you may be right. Maybe Brexit was just the first earthquake. Simon, I thank you. We're out of time. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:46, and time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz. The Brexit Secretary, Steve Barclay, is up on his feet in the House of Commons, summing up in this debate, and they will move to the division lobbies at 7 o'clock. We, of course, are particularly looking for the Yvette Cooper amendment, which, of course, says if there is no deal agreed by the end of February, we should extend Article 50, perhaps until the end of the year. And the other one, of course, is the Sir Graham Brady amendment, which is basically saying we must seek alternative arrangements to the backstop, and the Prime Minister has backed that up today by saying she wants to reopen the withdrawal agreement. And I'm asking, are the EU going to budge on this? Jason is a first-time caller from Ellesmere Port. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Nigel.
I'm all right, you know. I'd rather it was all done and dusted, Jason, really, but hey.
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to ask you a question. Reference the deal as it stands with the 39 billion. Should we go down that? And when would we actually pay that amount of money to them?
Be in a series of stages, and it would almost be like a continued membership fee, effectively, during the transition period.
Right. So if we were to go down the no-deal route, then we essentially have that money. Why can't we then use that to support businesses, etc., during the interim period?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Insecure or about what has happened, just to provide more stability.
A 39 billion featherbed, Jason. That's what it would be.
Yeah. I mean, surely, if we have that money, why not go down the no deal and use that?
Jason, what she ought to say to him is, right, we are not giving you 39 billion unless you make some concessions. Then I think, do you know what, we might just get some, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel that she will get nowhere tonight or tomorrow. I don't think anything will change.
I don't either. Jason, I thank you. I'm going to go down to College Green, Westminster, to speak to LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood. Theo, hi there.
Good evening, Nigel. The action taking place away from the Commons chamber, the European Research Group, which is led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Brexiters within the Conservative Party have just been meeting. They've decided to back the Brady amendment, the vast majority of them getting behind that. They see this as the last opportunity for Theresa May. A statement's just dropped actually from Steve Baker, who's the vice chairman of that group. We have collectively agreed to support Brady on the basis of the Prime Minister's promises, especially reopening the withdrawal agreement, and that the backstop is only the worst problem. I spoke to Andrew Rossendale. He's a MP for Romford, and he is probably one of the most hard-line Brexiters within the Conservative Party.
The Brady amendment, supporting it tonight does not indicate support for the withdrawal agreement should it come back in a couple of weeks, and I think there's a consensus around that view. I think on balance this gives the Prime Minister 2 more weeks to go away and get tough with the EU and hopefully come back with something that's more acceptable. If it's not, then we'll vote the withdrawal agreement down again.
You're doing this reluctantly by the sound of it?
Yes.
That was Andrew Rossendale. Now the first vote this evening is going to be on the Jeremy Corbyn amendment. Labour MPs will be voting for that en masse, and that states that there should be a permanent customs union between the United Kingdom and the European Union. We'll then have an amendment from the SNP. Ian Blackford is the chief signatory on that. He's the leader of the SNP in Westminster, calling for an extension to Article 50. That won't pass because obviously the SNP only have 35 MPs, and with the support of Labour there won't be enough. Then comes the Dominic Grieve amendment at around 7:30, calling for a series of indicative votes to try and test what Parliament would vote for. That has a lot of support. That vote's going to be very close. And then the big one coming in at 8:15, which is Yvette Cooper, Nick Bowles, calling for an extension of Article 50 through to the end of the December. Now, what we're hearing, Nigel, is that there are going to be a number of abstentions and possibly even front benchers on the Labour side voting against Yvette Cooper because they're very unhappy about what their voters, particularly in the north of England and Leeds constituencies, will think of Labour's efforts to block Brexit. And what's interesting is when the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell was asked whether those MPs, particularly on the front bench, who'd vote against the Labour whip and against Yvette Cooper, whether they'd resign or be sacked, he was very, very wishy-washy, very unclear about whether Labour would enforce that convention that if you're a member of the front bench team and you vote against the whip, then you are forced to give up your job or be sacked. So some inference there that perhaps Jeremy Corbyn, worried that he'll be seen as the man who has stopped Brexit, willing to tolerate, willing to allow insubordination amongst his junior ministers, because he's very, very worried, Nigel.
I mean, they've tried to play all ends against the middle on this.
Exactly.
And in the 2017 general election, he got away with it, with Leavers in the North voting Labour and Remainers in London voting Labour. But in the end, I guess you can't do it forever. Is your sense, Theo, that the Cooper-Bowles amendment is probably not going to get through?
It is looking incredibly close. A week ago, it was looking like it was going to get through with the support of Labour. Of course, that wasn't as forthcoming as many on Remain Labour MPs had been hoping, but it is by no means a given. It would require 25-30 Conservative MPs to support it, given the number of abstentions that have been talked about on the Labour side. The other big one for Theresa May particularly is the Brady Amendment. That comes last. We'll get that result depending on what happens with the Brady-Cooper Amendment, because there are two other amendments that come after that, which would immediately fall if Cooper-Bowles is passed. So we'd get the result for Brady at around 8:45, 9 p.m.
Yep.
And it is looking now with the ERG coming on board, there'll be a couple of stragglers, but if Labour MPs in Leave constituencies again support the Prime Minister, then that could pass. And that's really important for the Prime Minister, because she has said repeatedly, her supporters have said repeatedly, the Chief Whip Julian Smith has said repeatedly, that in order to go back to Brussels and ask for anything, she has to have the approval of Parliament, that she can actually get a deal through the House of Commons.
Which this would give the impression that she perhaps could. Yeah, fine.
Exactly.
Theo, thanks ever so much indeed. What a very exciting series of votes coming up. I'm hoping, of course, that the Cooper-Bowles amendment doesn't go through. I sense that it won't. I think that she's going to go back to Brussels this week and try and get more. We'll get a very rapid reaction from Brussels, and I should be sitting in seat number 20 tomorrow in the European Parliament in Brussels, and guess who will be in seat number 21? None other than Jean-Claude Juncker, refreshed from lunch, and we shall see what the answer is. Are they going to make concessions? Don't expect any in the short term, but folks, I promise you, if they thought we were serious about leaving